The Shadow Diplomats: How CIA Operatives Shaped Global Alliances. Part 1. The doors behind the world, the corridors of power, rarely echo with footsteps. They absorb them, swallow them, turning every movement into a whisper of intentions buried beneath diplomacy and ceremony. The story of the Shadow Diplomats begins on a night when the world believed it already understood how alliances were forged, unaware that the true architects worked far from podiums and treaties, moving silently between embassies, intelligence rooms, and back-channel meetings that existed only in fragments of classified archives. The first embers of this hidden network were lit at a time when the post-war map of influence was still soft clay, waiting for the hands bold enough to shape it. In Washington, a single encrypted cable arrived in a small office beneath the State Department building. The analyst who decoded it understood immediately that it wasn't meant to be read by just anyone. It carried a signature the newly formed agency used only for operations requiring absolute discretion, the sort that neither Congress nor foreign ministries would ever officially acknowledge. At the center of the message was a request that seemed simple yet carried the weight of a changing world. Identify nations whose public stance differed from the intentions whispered by their inner circles. It wasn't espionage for secrets, it was espionage for influence. The idea was to locate governments drifting quietly between superpowers, those whose loyalties could still be shaped before global lines hardened. The agency didn't want spies this time. It wanted diplomats who could be ghosts when needed and negotiators when circumstances demanded. People who could read a room without revealing their own presence. The first among them was a man whose official record described him as a cultural liaison, but whose travel logs and unlisted meetings painted a different picture. He moved like a man accustomed to fading into environments that demanded caution. In Paris, he blended with scholars debating post-war ideologies. In Cairo, he conversed with ministers who pretended they weren't aligning with anyone. In Ankara, he listened to generals who spoke confidently in private but cautiously in public. His task wasn't to gather intelligence. It was to understand intentions long before leaders voiced them and to position the agency in a way that would influence those decisions without appearing to influence them at all. These operatives were unofficial diplomats, unseen hands adjusting the balance of global relations. They had no embassies, yet they navigated nations. They had no flags, yet they protected national interests. Their work required subtlety, patience, and the ability to make small conversations shift into large consequences. That night, the operative in Paris found himself walking through a dimly lit street near the river, heading toward a quiet cafe that closed its doors early but never turned away familiar faces. Inside, a regional advisor awaited him, speaking softly about a potential alliance that could tip influence further east. An alliance the agency needed to understand before it solidified. The operative listened without asking questions, because in this world, the fewer questions asked, the more trust offered. His goal was to sense whether the advisor's words were shaped by personal conviction or the pressure of a government seeking new alignments. A single word spoken with too much hesitation or too much confidence would reveal the truth. Meanwhile, another operative traveled through Athens under the cover of trade negotiations. His presence near military officials was viewed as incidental. What no one realized was that his casual conversations over tea were mapping the emerging loyalties of a region still recovering from conflict. Each detail added to a foundation of intelligence that didn't warn of threats, but forecast opportunities. And in Tokyo, the third operative sat in a silent room with a diplomat who believed he was receiving advice from a friendly nation rather than from a hidden arm of American strategy. The operative's influence wasn't applied through force or manipulation, but through clarity. He helped the diplomat understand what alliances would mean years from now rather than months. It was a shift in global thinking disguised as a personal conversation. These early shadows shaped the beginnings of a network that would quietly steer world politics for decades. They were the unseen architects who built friendships between nations, not through treaties, but through trust. created not in conference halls but in private rooms, quiet cafes, and improvised backchannels where the real weight of diplomacy rested. As months passed, this network grew, mapping the shifting sands of global influence. The operatives shared no uniforms and held no titles that linked them. They communicated through phrases tucked inside ordinary diplomatic cables, slipping through systems unnoticed. What they built wasn't an alliance. It was an understanding, a quiet thread that could pull nations toward stability when conflicts threatened to boil or nudge them toward cooperation when isolation seemed inevitable. Their presence was never confirmed, yet their absence was always felt when tensions rose without explanation. Among those who first observed this emerging network was a young officer stationed at a secure facility in Virginia. He noticed patterns in global decisions that didn't match official diplomatic activities. Nations changed their stances without formal persuasion. Leaders shifted alliances without public reasoning. The officer realized that something invisible was guiding these decisions, something operating beneath the surface of global politics. His curiosity became the spark that would eventually lead him to the core of the program, a program whose existence only a handful of people knew. One evening, while reviewing classified cables, he found a message containing a familiar signature. Though heavily coded, its purpose was clear. A major alliance in Eastern Europe was nearing a turning point, and the network had to move fast. The unseen diplomats were being summoned again to nudge a decision that could alter the balance of power for an entire generation. The officer leaned back in his chair, sensing that whatever would unfold in the coming days would determine not only the future of alliances, but also the true reach of the agency he served. He closed the file carefully, aware that he had stepped into a world where influence was more powerful than intelligence reports and where conversations carried more weight than weapons. It was here that the real diplomacy began, carried by shadows that shaped nations without ever appearing in history books. The signal beneath the silence, it was here that the real diplomacy began, carried by shadows that shaped nations without ever appearing in history books. The young officer who had stumbled onto the network's traces found himself drawn deeper every day, not by orders, but by the gravity of patterns too deliberate to ignore. He noticed how certain nations shifted tone before international crises erupted, how ambassadors softened their positions without visible negotiations, how leaders who publicly disagreed reached quiet understandings that saved regions from sliding into confrontation. None of this happened in official conference rooms. These were movements beneath the surface, silent currents guiding entire continents. Inside the intelligence facility, the officer's role changed subtly. Senior analysts who once handed him routine tasks began forwarding him specialized cables that required interpretation rather than translation. They didn't explain why. They didn't need to. His ability to connect fragmented signals had become too valuable. The cables came from embassies where meetings never appeared on schedules, and from diplomats whose names were absent from public rosters. Every message contained hints of an ongoing influence campaign that shaped alliances not with promises but with understanding crafted in private dialogues. The officer soon realized that the network didn't pressure nations. It anticipated them. When a government hesitated between two global powers, the operatives identified the underlying fears driving that hesitation. A leader concerned about economic vulnerability was offered clarity on market stability. A minister worried about regional threats was given a realistic assessment of risks. Long before those threats appeared in reports, the operatives didn't alter decisions, they illuminated them. That was their power. Influence without force. Direction without exposure. In one instance, a small nation at the edge of a strategic coastline found itself courted by multiple global players. Publicly, it claimed neutrality. Privately, it feared isolation. When the operative assigned to the region met the country's deputy minister, he didn't ask for loyalty. He simply asked what stability looked like for their people over the next decade. The minister's answer revealed more than any intelligence assessment could. It showed where the nation's future pointed before the nation itself understood it. Weeks later, the country announced a partnership beneficial to regional balance, surprising analysts around the world. Only a handful knew the quiet conversation that made the decision possible. Meanwhile, in another part of the world, an operative in Buenos Aires navigated a political landscape layered with shifting alliances. He met journalists in crowded cafes, not to manipulate stories, but to understand public sentiment that shaped political courage. Public opinion wasn't a target. It was a compass, a silent indicator of where national leaders felt safe to lean. By understanding its direction, the operative could predict diplomatic movements long before they unfolded on the global stage. Back in Virginia, the young officer continued tracing the network's invisible pathways. He noticed that every major alliance shift in the past year aligned with activity from operatives whose identities remained classified even within the agency. He created a private map on a secure terminal connecting dates, meetings, and regional outcomes. Over time, a pattern emerged. The operatives acted not in isolation, but as synchronized nodes responding to moments the world didn't even recognize as critical transitions. Their influence worked like gravity. Subtle, constant, unavoidable. The officer's analysis eventually reached a senior director who had monitored his progress quietly. The director called him into a soundproof room layered with decades of classified history. Without introduction, he placed a thin folder on the table. Inside were profiles without names, only code names, operational footprints, and timelines marked with significant diplomatic shifts. The director looked at him and said that unofficial diplomacy had kept more regions stable than any treaty ever could. The officer realized he was being invited not to observe the network, but to understand its purpose. Outside the walls of intelligence buildings, the operatives continued shaping global currents. In Stockholm, one operative met a defense planner whose nation debated signing a new regional pact. The operative didn't argue for or against. Instead, he outlined the long-term implications of each path and left the decision entirely to the planner. It wasn't persuasion, it was perspective. Months later, when the nation announced its alignment, the planner privately recalled the conversation as the moment clarity formed. In Nairobi, another operative attended a cultural summit where artists, scholars, and ministers gathered. Beyond the performances and speeches, the operative listened to underlying concerns shaping regional cooperation. Cultural fears, economic shifts, generational aspirations, each revealed how nations viewed themselves before they viewed allies. Understanding those self-perceptions allowed the network to foresee alliances years in advance. Amid all this, the officer received a final encrypted cable that connected everything. The message mentioned an emerging divide in a region whose stability influenced multiple alliances. The network was preparing to intervene, not through confrontation, but through guidance offered to leaders caught between competing pressures. The officer understood what was being asked. He was to synthesize the fragmented signals, identify where influence would be most effective, and provide the operatives with the clarity they needed for their next moves. As he worked through the night, piecing together political intentions, public sentiments, and regional anxieties, he felt the weight of what this invisible network had built over decades. Not control, not dominance, but balance created through understanding. His final analysis would determine where the shadows would move next and how alliances would shift silently without ever acknowledging the hands that steadied them. In the quiet room, illuminated only by the glow of classified files, he finalized his report, knowing it would guide conversations that would never appear in official archives, yet would shape the future of nations in ways the world would never fully see. The conversations that never echoed in the quiet room, illuminated only by the glow of classified files, he finalized his report, knowing it would guide conversations that would never appear in official archives yet would shape the future of nations in ways the world would never fully see. The report moved through secure channels with the quiet urgency of something that mattered more than anyone would publicly admit. It reached operatives already dispersed across continents, each working within environments where a single word carried more weight than signed agreements. They didn't wait for further instructions. They already understood that the world didn't pause for decisions. It shifted beneath them, and they had to move with it. In Lisbon, the operative known only through a codename sat across from a naval strategist whose country held a crucial position on Atlantic routes. Official meetings were scheduled for trade discussions, but the real conversation happened afterward in a corridor lit by a single flickering lamp. The operative didn't bring maps or reports. He asked only how the strategist viewed the next decade of maritime security. The answer revealed the subtle tensions shaping the region, tensions that could tilt alliances if left unattended. With that understanding, the operative offered a perspective framed not as advice but as a possible horizon. It was enough. Clarity always traveled farther than persuasion. Far east, another operative walked along a quiet garden path with a foreign policy advisor whose nation balanced itself carefully between emerging global powers. The advisor spoke softly, aware of how easily intentions could be misinterpreted in official rooms. Here among silent trees, he revealed concerns about technological dependency, regional mistrust, and the fear of becoming a pawn in larger conflicts. The operative listened not to respond but to map every layer of unspoken anxiety. Later, his subtle observations would help reframe an entire country's diplomatic approach, steering it towards stability without any signatures or public acknowledgments. Back in the intelligence facility, the young officer followed the operative's movements through coded check-ins. They never reported actions, only atmospheres. A region warming to cooperation. A minister reconsidering old assumptions. A political faction losing momentum. These signals formed a mosaic that no single report could capture yet. Together, they revealed the shifting trajectory of alliances across multiple continents. The officer saw patterns forming before the world saw events unfolding. One afternoon, the senior director summoned him again, this time to an even smaller room where the air felt heavy with decades of unspoken stories. The director explained that diplomacy, as the world understood it, was often too slow to keep up with crises that didn't announce themselves. Official channels required procedure. Unofficial ones required understanding. The network existed to fill the space between what governments feared and what they hoped. The officer realized that the operatives weren't influencing nations to choose sides. They were guiding them to choose stability before uncertainty grew into conflict. Meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, the operative stationed there conducted a quiet meeting at a rooftop cafe overlooking the city's fading sunset. The official agenda listed cultural collaboration. The real purpose was a single conversation with an emerging political figure whose speeches hinted at foreign policy, changes that could unsettle regional balance. Instead of confronting the figure, the operative asked him to imagine how his nation's decisions would be remembered 30 years from now. That single shift in perspective turned a bold strategy into a responsible one, and the tension that threatened the region eased without a single headline acknowledging why. Elsewhere, a crucial moment unfolded in a capital known for its unpredictable political climate. A sudden leadership change created a vacuum where competing factions attempted to steer foreign alignment. The operative embedded there requested an unscheduled walk with a senior advisor who held sway over the interim government. They walked through an old marketplace crowded with people unaware of the enormous geopolitical shift quietly emerging around them. During the conversation, the operative helped the advisor articulate not what foreign powers wanted, but what the nation itself needed to feel secure. Within hours, the advisor recommended a neutral stance that prevented a major diplomatic rift. Across the ocean, another operative discreetly attended a symposium on energy policy held behind closed doors. Delegates debated future supply chains, alliances, and technological dependencies. The operative didn't speak during the sessions, but during breaks navigated micro-conversations where true intentions surfaced. These subtle exchanges revealed which countries were ready to strengthen partnerships and which feared hidden costs. His observations fed directly into the network's broader understanding of where influence would be most effective in the coming months. For the young officer, each of these interactions was another stroke in a portrait of global diplomacy few would ever comprehend. The network's influence didn't change nations overnight. It created ripples, small, steady, and deliberate. Over time, those ripples aligned into waves that shifted international strategies without drawing attention. The officer understood now why history books rarely matched what actually happened. The world recorded decisions, but not the quiet conversations that made those decisions possible. Late one night, as he reviewed new encrypted updates, he noticed a single coded phrase appearing across multiple regions. It signaled the beginning of something larger than individual interventions, something that required the network to synchronize its efforts with precision. A convergence of political transitions, global uncertainties, and emerging alliances was forming a scenario that could redefine strategic landscapes. The network was preparing to guide the world through a moment that would test everything it had built. The officer leaned forward, absorbing the implications. Whatever was coming would not be shaped in public forums or televised negotiations. It would take form in private rooms, whispered discussions, and subtle clarifications offered at just the right moments. The shadow diplomats were being positioned for their most delicate maneuver yet, and the stability of several regions depended on whether they could interpret the world's intentions before the world fully understood them itself. The shadow diplomats were being positioned for their most delicate maneuver yet, and the stability of several regions depended on whether they could interpret the world's intentions before the world fully understood them itself. In Washington, the briefing room had fallen into a careful hush as Director Hale stood over the projection table, studying a glowing web of shifting alliances as if watching countenance breathe. Nothing about the moment felt stable, and the diplomats knew that wherever the pressure point appeared first, they would need to reach it before any nation realized it had shifted. Hale's voice slid into the room like a quiet metronome as he explained that 3 regions were tilting toward unexpected realignments. At the same time, and each tilt was triggered not by armies or treaties, but by whispers in foreign ministries far from the world's cameras. The diplomats listened not as officers, but as human accelerometers trained to feel tremors most governments ignored. Their strength was not force, but interpretation, because in this kind of war, the first to understand the narrative controlled the outcome. An intercepted draft speech from a neutral country hinted at a sudden cooperation with a rival bloc, but its tone carried contradictions. That suggested the writer wanted one alliance while the cabinet wanted another. A shipment of rare minerals quietly rerouted across 2 continents had no signatures matching the businesses supposedly behind it, which meant a proxy player had entered the field. And a chain of cultural exchanges being arranged between 2 states long. Considered incompatible meant that someone somewhere was trying to soften a border without declaring it. Hale assigned teams like a conductor placing instruments. Mara and Quinn would move toward the mineral trail because both could read commercial fog better than any. Analyst in the building, Eaton would travel under diplomatic cover into the capital, shaping the draft. Speech to discover whether the shift was real or a bluff. Silva and Rowan were dispatched toward the cultural exchange corridor, where soft power often disguised hard consequences. These assignments were not simply tasks, but trust, because each team had to interpret a region's emotional temperature and adjust the United States' posture without miscommunication or arrogance. A wrong reading could cause a nation to pivot away permanently, and in this arena, a pivot was more dangerous than a missile. Mara and Quinn departed first, using a carrier-level business summit in Lisbon as their entry point. The summit looked like a collage of polished handshakes and choreographed panels. But behind the curtains, the world's mining corridors were fiercely political. Mara blended into the crowd as a commercial liaison, while Quinn ghosted as a logistics consultant known for predicting market shifts. Their target was a delegate whose travel patterns suggested hidden meetings with entities not on the official roster. He was a man who never stayed still long enough to be pinned in any national category but his briefcase carried contracts that could reshape supply chains for years. When Mara finally intercepted him, she didn't question him, but questioned the flow of conversation around him, which revealed more than the man himself. Every person who greeted him spoke as if they knew a secret but assumed he did not, which meant he was being used as a carrier for influence rather than a creator of it. Across the world, Eaton arrived under a fog of polite confusion. The ministry he entered felt divided not by ideology but by fear of choosing incorrectly in a moment when every global alignment seemed temporary. He sat through staged greetings and diplomatic tea, but his eyes tracked microgestures. The deputy minister kept glancing toward a closed door, as if someone behind it held the real authority. The writer of the intercepted speech avoided eye contact entirely because he had likely been instructed to craft a message he didn't believe in. Eaton played the role of the oblivious attach until he wasn't. When he finally gained a private moment with the writer, he slipped him a coded sentence wrapped inside an innocuous comment about regional conferences. The writer froze. He understood. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation to reveal who was pushing the speech and why. Meanwhile, Silva and Rowan drifted through the cultural exchange corridor, like travelers with no appointments. They moved between museums, academic talks, and embassy receptions in two countries that swore friendship yet acted like reluctant strangers. Cultural diplomacy could be either a lubricant or a weapon, and their job was to know which role it was playing here. Silva noticed that the newly designed joint festival banners displayed symbols slightly altered from traditional motifs, a subtle cue hinting that one side was asserting its identity more strongly than the other. Rowan observed that the translators at events were not using the official diplomatic dialect, but a softer version of it, often chosen when a third party was coaching. This meant an outside influence had stepped in quietly, trying to rewrite a narrative without anyone realizing. Their findings returned to Washington as threads that Hawley tied together through the night. The draft speech was indeed engineered by an internal faction pushing for a discrete alignment. But their influence was fragile, dependent on a single external sponsor not yet identified. The mineral trail wasn't about resources, but about leverage. Someone was manipulating supply chain footprints to alter global dependency patterns. And the cultural shifts pointed toward a sophisticated operation focused on reshaping public sentiment so slowly that by the time governments noticed the narrative would already feel natural. By dawn, Hale understood what the diplomats were facing. Someone was building a three-layered alliance structure, designed to pull several regions toward an emerging bloc without firing a shot. And that someone was patient, clever, and possibly already inside the diplomatic circles the CIA thought it understood. The shadow diplomats had been right to sense the tremor, but now the tremor was becoming direction. They weren't just interpreting intentions anymore. They were racing them. They weren't just interpreting intentions anymore. They were racing them, and the velocity of this race was beginning to reshape the invisible. Borders between nations, as if someone had taken the globe and rotated it a few degrees without telling the world. Inside, Langley Hale studied new intelligence patterns that appeared overnight, forming a structure too deliberate to be coincidence. It was as if a strategist was orchestrating alignments the way a conductor guides an orchestra with the faintest movement of a baton. Hale recalled every fragment the shadow diplomats had collected, so far the rewritten speech, drafts, the mineral detours, the altered festival. Symbols, the untraceable advisor who traveled like vapor. Together they formed a matrix, and the matrix was accelerating. Mara and Quinn were the first to confirm that the consortium behind the mineral routes was not actually a business entity, but an influence engine hidden behind shipping companies and logistics labs. Its members met only in disguised capacity, blending into global summits as consultants, economists, and trade experts. What united them was not profit, but philosophy, because every trade corridor they touched redirected dependency patterns for entire regions. Quinn realized the consortium was quietly constructing a new backbone of supply chains, meant to give their emerging blocs soft control over T's. With quaint to T's. Where are you seeing? Where are you seeing? Where are you seeing? Where are you seeing seen? Where are you seeing you see? Where are you seeing de risting? Where are you seeing seen? Quain seeing plays. Quain me. Where are seeing? By we see you Oz. How I see it. I will lid. I see me mine all but decor cause I can cad. Let I see you sit to slide to sit I bleed I to sa cause I like could I be these great to these gets good that was cut but it's submit stuff where the nations that depended on imported minerals. Mara sensed that the consortium's real power lay not in what they owned, but in what they could reroute and deny without ever appearing responsible. Eaton's trail of the advisor grew stranger. Each institution the advisor visited claimed the interaction was informal, yet their archives showed faint traces of redacted entries, involving joint recommendations on cooperation and stability. The language used in those recommendations matched the same ideological phrasing that had appeared in different countries, almost like scripted political resonance. The symbol Eaton kept finding a stylized compass etched faintly on reservation. Logs seemed to be a signature, or maybe a recruitment marker. Eaton suspected that the advisor was a single operative, but part of a school of influence architects trained to design diplomatic narratives rather than negotiate them. Whoever trained them believed that alliances could be engineered through shared language long before treaties existed. Silva and Rowan's pursuit of the mysterious foundation revealed that its grants were not philanthropic at all. The funding bundles targeted intellectuals capable of shaping public imagination through exhibitions, lectures, and collaborative events that promoted unity themes tailored to match the Velvet Alignment's ideological direction. The money passed through financial shells that dissolved the moment attention approached them. Rowan noted that this pattern resembled cultural scaffolding, a process in which emotions were shaped before politics caught up. Silva understood that if a society's imagination aligned with an idea, political alignment would follow naturally. This meant the Velvet Alignment was not only political and economic, but psychological. Hale gathered every update and realized that the architect behind the Velvet Alignment was constructing a multi-level gravitational field around nations, making them feel as if the shift toward unity was their own decision. This was power at its most refined power without fingerprints. The team dispersed again, moving through airports, coffee shops, embassies, and conferences with the grace of people trained to be invisible. Each step brought them closer to an unsettling realization. The Velvet Alignment wasn't trying to dominate nations. It was trying to synchronize them as if preparing the world for a new ideological map designed by a mind that understood how to use silence as a tool. Every clue pointed to an architect with extraordinary patience, someone who had moved influence threads for years without detection. As the shadow diplomats stepped deeper into the labyrinth, the same question echoed through every mission channel. If someone could realign nations using nothing but whispers art and redirected supply chains, then what vision were they building and how close were they to completing it? Was the question that followed the shadow diplomats like a second shadow as they moved deeper into the shifting corridors of global influence. Hale reread the compiled intel again and again until he felt the pattern forming behind the data like an image emerging in developing fluid. The Velvet Alignment was no longer an invisible current. It was now a rising tide, gently lifting entire regions off their traditional anchors and placing them into a new gravitational circle. What disturbed Hale was not its ambition, but its elegance, because only a strategist with a rare understanding of cultural psychology, diplomacy, and economics could design an alignment that looked organic while being entirely artificial. Mara and Quinn's infiltration into the consortium revealed the first glimpse of the Velvet Alignment's spine. They identified 12 recurring attendees across different logistics summits, all moving under unrelated identities, yet sharing the same behavioral rhythm. They never spoke directly to each other in public, but their panel contributions always steered the conversation toward autonomy, sustainability, and dependence themes that sounded harmless yet carried subtle ideological weight. The consortium wasn't creating new economic structures. It was nudging existing ones into predictable patterns so that nations would unknowingly drift toward regions the architect favored. Quinn realized that the consortium's greatest strength was its ability to adjust global supply networks while disguising the shifts as market evolution. Eaton, meanwhile, had tracked the compass symbol across diplomatic academies and policy think tanks in Europe and Asia. Everywhere the symbol appeared, there had been workshops on cooperative governance and integrated security models, yet none were officially linked. The symbol wasn't just a mark. It was curriculum, signifying a school of influence engineering. The people who passed through these programs weren't traditional diplomats. They were narrative architects, trained to guide nations toward alignment by shaping speeches, policy drafts, and internal debates. Eaton understood that the advisor he followed was one of many graduates of this hidden school. And the Velvet Alignment was its long game, a generational plan crafted in academic basements rather than war rooms. Silva and Rowan's pursuit of the cultural foundation exposed the third dimension of the architect's vision. They discovered that the next cultural convergence was planned in a historic city, chosen not for politics, but for symbolism. The event's theme was Future Without Borders, a title subtle enough to appear inspirational, but precise enough to align with the ideological direction of the Velvet Alignment. Artists, scholars, and influencers from different continents were being funded to produce work that hinted at a shared global identity. Silva recognized that the foundation wasn't influencing governments directly. It was influencing people and letting governments follow naturally once public sentiment shifted. Hale reviewed the combined findings and saw the Velvet Alignment for what it was, a soft structure. Meant to bind nations without coercion through synchronized culture, aligned policy, language, and economic dependency patterns. Traditional intelligence systems weren't built to counter something this quiet and this patient. Hale realized the shadow diplomats needed to discover not only the architect, but the blueprint, because the alignment's ultimate phase would be the moment nations believed the ideological shift was their own initiative. Once that happened, no intervention could reverse it. He called the team into a secure channel and issued new directives. Mara and Quinn would track the consortium's inner circle by mapping their off-schedule movements. Eaton would build a profile of the hidden school, its founders, its financiers, and its earliest graduates. Silva and Rowan would embed themselves inside the convergence event, not as observers, but as contributors using their cover identities. To access private forums where cultural strategists discussed long-term influence arcs, none of them were to expose their identities. The architect needed to believe the world was still blind to the alignment's true shape. Mara and Quinn followed the consortium representatives after the maritime panels and realized they always regrouped at quiet cafes rather than conference halls. They exchanged nothing but subtle nods as if confirming progress. Quinn mapped their habits and discovered that each representative specialized in a specific corridor: energy, rare minerals, maritime routes, digital trade flows. It meant the consortium wasn't an organization. It was a distributed mind, a collective of specialists aligning global choke points to the same ideological horizon. Mara realized the consortium was phase 2 of the Velvet Alignment, the economic spine that would make political and cultural shifts irreversible. Eaton dug deeper into archives until he found something extraordinary. The original blueprint for the Compass curriculum was drafted 24 years ago by an unnamed think tank that dissolved months after it was formed. The blueprint wasn't about diplomacy. It was about cognitive synchronization, teaching future advisors how to plant ideas in political systems by aligning them with emotional narratives. It wasn't manipulation. It was choreography. Whoever wrote that blueprint was likely the architect, or at least the architect's mentor. Eaton knew he was getting close, but the closer he got, the more he sensed the architect watching the watchers. Silva and Rowan arrived at the convergence venue under deep cultural cover, blending into artists, collectives, and academic groups. The city buzzed with rehearsals, exhibitions, and quiet salons where ideas flowed more freely than wine. In one closed session, Rowan overheard a strategist discussing how societies move, not when told to move, but when shown a future they already desire. Silva recognized the phrasing. It matched the advisor's speech structure, the consortium's talking points, and the foundation's grant themes. Everything was connected. The velvet alignment wasn't just synchronizing nations. It was synchronizing imaginations. Late that night, Halley received a secure transmission from an anonymous source. No signature, no trace, no metadata. Only a single sentence and a symbol. The symbol was the compass. And the sentence read, "You are studying the surface, not the design." Hale stared at the screen, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. The architect had seen them. And the game had just shifted. And the game had just shifted in a way none of the shadow diplomats had anticipated, because for the first time, the architect had revealed awareness of their presence. Hale sensed it immediately. The anonymous message wasn't a threat. It was a move, a deliberate adjustment, and a silent duel of interpretation, where each side tried to shape the other's next step without ever meeting. The compass symbol on the transmission glowed faintly on Hale's screen, as if mocking the idea that any of them were ahead. Hale realized the architect wasn't trying to scare them. He was inviting them deeper into the labyrinth to see whether they were capable of understanding its true structure. Mara and Quinn, operating inside the consortium's orbit, felt the shift almost instantly. The representatives they had been shadowing for days suddenly altered their routes, skipping familiar cafes and abandoning predictable patterns. It was as if someone had whispered to them that observers were nearby. Quinn knew this meant only one thing. The Velvet Alignment had an internal alert system built into their behavior protocols. Not electronic, psychological, subtle shifts in language and movement that signaled when to disappear or reorganize. Mara noticed that one of the representatives left behind an intentionally misplaced notebook. It contained nothing but blank pages except for a single phrase on the inside cover. "The map moves with the observer." Mara understood that the architect wanted to test how they reacted when the trail bent away. Eaton, meanwhile, found his access to archives suddenly becoming slippery. Records he had previously viewed without issue now required special authorization. Institutions that had been cooperative days earlier suddenly responded with diplomatic politeness that felt rehearsed. Even the old blueprint he uncovered seemed to rearrange itself the more he studied it, revealing new layers of structure hidden behind generic academic phrasing. The compass symbol began appearing not only in the margins of documents, but in unexpected places. An embossed mark on a conference brochure, a tiny signature in the corner of an old policy diagram, a watermark only visible under certain lighting. Eaton realized the symbol wasn't a logo. It was a navigation tool indicating which minds had been shaped by the curriculum and which projects belonged to the Velvet Alignment. The architect wasn't hiding his influence. He was cataloging it. Silva and Rowan embedded deeper into the cultural convergence event, where the atmosphere had shifted from creative collaboration to quiet orchestration. Conversations no longer flowed freely, but followed subtle thematic arcs as if guided by invisible rails. At a private salon, Rowan noticed that the speakers were no longer describing unity, but inevitability, presenting their ideas as though they were the natural evolution of global culture. Silva attended a closed workshop on narrative construction and recognized a technique from an old classified manual on ideological harmonization. Except this version was cleaner, more elegant, refined over decades. The facilitator spoke about shaping collective identity through emotional resonance rather than debate, a method that aligned perfectly with the Velvet Alignment's psychological blueprint. Silva realized the cultural architects weren't spreading ideas. They were tuning emotional frequencies. Back in Langley, Hale assembled the new intel and sensed something deeper behind the architect's actions. The velvet alignment had now entered its defensive phase. It was no longer expanding quietly. It was protecting its core. Hale believed every one of the shadow diplomats was now being evaluated not as threats, but as variables. If the architect could anticipate their methods, he could redirect the alignment's evolution in real time. Hale warned the team that they were no longer observing a structure. They were inside it. Mara and Quinn finally located one of the consortium's key figures at an unscheduled meeting inside an abandoned maritime station. They watched from a distance as the figure communicated through gestures rather than words with a group of intermediaries. Dressed so ordinarily, they blended into the city. Quinn noticed the intermediaries carried no devices, not even identification. The meeting ended with a silent exchange of envelopes and a synchronized departure pattern. Mara identified the gesture the leader gave at the end, a subtle tilt of the hand identical to the symbol engraved in the compass blueprint. This was confirmation that the consortium's leadership wasn't decentralized. It was coordinated by graduates of the same hidden school that trained the advisor. Eaton, meanwhile, uncovered a classified index referencing an unlisted academic retreat held once every decade. Its location changed each time, but its theme remained constant: forging intellectual frameworks for global cooperation. The alumni list was missing, redacted, or non-existent. Eaton suspected that the architect either founded this retreat or used it as a recruitment ground for narrative engineers. One line in an old internal memo caught his eye: "Harmonization is not persuasion. It is recognition." Eaton understood the meaning instantly. The velvet alignment didn't convince nations to join. It recognized where their aspirations already leaned and shaped the path ahead of them. Silva and Rowan's breakthrough came unexpectedly when an elderly curator approached them after a panel. His eyes carried the weary calm of someone who had witnessed the alignment grow for decades. Without introducing himself, he simply said, "You are looking at the leaves when you should be studying the roots." Before they could respond, he slipped them a folded program and vanished into the crowd. The program contained a single handwritten line: "The architect speaks only through others. Seek the voice that never appears." Silva felt a chill. Rowan understood that the architect wasn't visible because the architect didn't need to be. The design spoke for them. When Halley received these updates, he knew the shadow diplomats were standing at the threshold of the velvet alignment S-core. The architect had allowed them to get this far because understanding the system was part of the system's test. Hale understood the next phase wouldn't be about discovering the architect's identity. It would be about discovering the architect's intention. Because whoever could realign nations through subtle gravitational pull instead of pressure or fear wasn't playing a political game. 0 and play. Can it sui because it's a sit so sleek is in sit skik to bike I to reason I blade it is kit but and public it's totally is this to feel it it's the use They were trying to rewrite how the world understands cooperation itself.